On June 22, 1940, an armistice was signed between France and Germany in the Compiègne forest. This effectively marked France's defeat in World War II. For many, the fact that France could only hold out for 40 days after the German offensive began came as a genuine shock. At the start of World War II, the French possessed the second largest number of tanks in the world, trailing only the Soviet Union. It seemed incredible that this armored force could not offer adequate resistance to the Germans. However, this defeat was predetermined. This was not due to the fiercely fighting French tank crews lacking experience. To a large extent, the 1940 defeat was predetermined by the tanks themselves that the French used in combat. During World War I, the French were the second nation to begin producing tanks and deploy them in battle. Although the British had the lead, it must be acknowledged that the French proved to be the best tank builders at that time. Instead of heavy tanks, they began with medium-class combat vehicles. One such vehicle, the Saint-Chamond, introduced a true revolution. This was because Émile Rimeillot, the chief designer of Compagnie des Forges et Aciéries de la Marine et d'Homecourt, applied an electric transmission to this tank. Unlike the British, the French quickly abandoned the fire hedgehog concept, where machine gun armament was placed around the perimeter of the vehicle. Instead, by 1917, the concept of a tank with turret-mounted armament developed. Furthermore, the French were the first to mass-produce a light tank, which was the famous Renault FT. It was the best and most widely produced tank of World War I, with its manufacturing distributed across several factories. The French also achieved great success in the development of heavy tanks. Although they entered serial production after the end of World War I, these machines became a true monument to technical ingenuity. The FCM-2C became the largest and heaviest tank mass-produced by the French. By dimensions, it remains the largest mass-produced tank in the world to this day. This vehicle was the first in the world to receive anti-shell armor, and also the world's first three-person turret, which housed a 75mm cannon. In several aspects, the FCM-2C did not become obsolete for more than 10 years, which contributed to its long service. The successes of French tank building also led to its stagnation. The French army entered the early 1920s with approximately 3,500 Renault FT tanks and several hundred outdated medium tanks in its arsenal. While the medium tanks quickly faded into obsolescence, the Renault FT had a career that lasted for over 2 decades. There were too many of these vehicles for the French army to consider their rapid replacement. A sharp reduction in funding only worsened the situation. However, the main problem was not funding or an excessive number of tanks. A decrease in funding did not prevent the British and Americans from conducting experimental work, thereby exploring potential future developments. As a result, the Americans, despite not receiving new mass-produced tanks for various reasons, carried out extensive work that proved useful in the 1930s. Meanwhile, the British took a leading position in tank production, both for their own use and for export. Only the French primarily focused on attempting to modernize the Renault FT. The only major program that involved the production of prototypes for battle tanks, or Char B tanks, was conceived by General Jean-Baptiste Estienne. He was previously known as the father of French tank building. Estienne's ideas were once revolutionary, but by the 1920s, many questions arose regarding them. By the early 1920s, the need to increase tank mobility and range became increasingly apparent. This led to work on wheeled-track tanks, though their initial implementation was not very successful. Meanwhile, tank speed gradually increased. It quickly surpassed 12.4 miles per hour, and by the end of the 1920s, it approached 18.6 to 21.7 miles per hour. However, Estienne had his own vision for a tank. He believed that instead of the Renault FT, tanks should be built with a combat weight of 31,526 pounds, armed with a 75mm caliber cannon located in the hull. In essence, it was a reimagined Schneider CA-1, but smaller and with a crew of 3. A turret was not mandatory for this tank, and even if present, nothing larger than machine guns was intended to be installed there. The first prototypes of the Char B appeared in 1924. Even at this stage, they had a combat weight of 34,172 to 41,188 pounds, and armor reaching 25 to 30 millimeters. At that time, such armor was considered shell-proof. Typical anti-tank armament was the 47mm Hotchkiss cannon, which had armor penetration of exactly about 25 millimeters. While SDN was trying to create a medium tank to replace light tanks, the technical section for combat tanks, or Section Technique des Chars de Combat, focused on developing light tanks. This led to the creation of the Renault NC1, a variant of the Renault NC light tank, with a new suspension and a turret armed with twin machine guns. Further development of the Renault FT resulted in the creation of the NC3 light tank, later adopted as the Char D1, also known as the Renault D1. Essentially, this was an enlarged Renault FT with a new chassis, a more powerful engine, and armor 30 millimeters thick. Additionally, the hull now included space for a radio operator. Initially, tanks of this type were equipped with turrets from the Renault FT, but new designs appeared later. In this regard, it was observed how French designers attempted to develop new turrets within the approximate dimensions of the Renault FT. Almost everywhere, this tank's turret was considered cramped, and the primary effort was to develop a more spacious design, such as for the Fiat 3000 and the MS-1. However, the French managed to install a 47mm cannon, coaxial with a machine gun, within the same turret ring and dimensions. This was not achieved on the first attempt, and the Char D1 featured a total of 4 turret types, including the temporary Renault FT turret. By early 1930, the French army had received nothing fundamentally new. Worse still, General Estienne and the French Army Command conceptually remained convinced that the next war would be the same as World War I. Meanwhile, local conflicts of the 1920s showed a different picture, both in terms of mobility and the overall concept of the tank. The French, however, continued to implement the lessons of World War I, gradually worsening their situation. In this sense, the situation that developed by the start of World War II was predetermined. General Estienne alone should not be blamed for this. The problem had many fathers. This included, first and foremost, the CCA, the Consultative Council on Armaments, which contained many controversial figures burdened with ranks and regalia. For example, General Charles Shedville can be recalled, who commanded the 2nd Tank Brigade, equipped with medium tanks during World War I. He firmly believed that the Char B should be the main French tank, and that light mass-produced combat vehicles were a relic of the past. An even more controversial figure was the Inspector General for Tanks, General Paul Velpri. In 1923, while still a colonel, he proposed a 600-ton tank. Later, he no longer promoted such monsters, but his subsequent publications revealed his views. The top brass of the CCA continued to envision massive tank offensives in the style of World War I, and in this light, the persistent desire to acquire the Char B seems logical. In the early 1930s, the French Army Command began to realize certain issues. The tank fleet was rapidly becoming obsolete, and the French held the status of the army with the largest number of tanks only nominally. In a way, the French were fortunate that no serious conflicts were anticipated in Europe by the early 1930s, and tank manufacturing in several countries was paralyzed as a result of the global financial crisis. Furthermore, in 1930, a disarmament conference took place in London, followed by another in Geneva in 1932. Following the 1930 conference, the combat weight of tanks was restricted to 25 tons, and the Geneva Conference threatened to lower the limit even further to 16 tons. This restriction was short-lived, but for a time it became a limiting factor for one of General Estienne's programs, heavy tank destroyers. These vehicles, weighing 44 to 55 tons, were intended to complement the Maginot Line. Work on these vehicles had been ongoing since 1928, developed at FCM and STCC. In 1932, work ceased, but only temporarily. The situation began to change in 1933 when the Nazis came to power in Germany. At that time, the only modern tank being produced in France was the Char D1, and even it had not yet received a fully functional turret. Moreover, it appeared only in 1936, significantly later than the tanks themselves. Additionally, in 1930, development began on an improved version of the tank, initially called the Renault UZ, but better known as the Char D2 or Renault D2. The prototype tank that appeared in 1932 was already classified as a medium tank. Ultimately, its combat weight exceeded 20 tons, while the armor thickness increased from 30 millimeters to 40 millimeters. Theoretically, this allowed the tank to be protected from 25mm cannon shells. Around the same time, the armor of the Char B1 was also reinforced to the same thickness, The problem was that, for several reasons, the French military standardized the turrets across different tank types. It seemed as though Estienne and his colleagues stubbornly refused to acknowledge what was happening in the rest of the world. This was especially true for the British, who used two-man turrets on both the medium tank Mark I and Mark II, and on the Vickers Mark E cannon version. The Renault FT turret already had many drawbacks, but here, one person was required to aim the cannon paired with a machine gun, reload them, try to observe the surroundings, and issue commands to the rest of the crew. In other words, with a stubbornness that could have been better applied elsewhere, the French military continued to try and get the most out of tank design principles from the early 1920s. During this time, the rest of the world had moved past tankettes, transitioning to producing light tanks with bulletproof armor and heavy machine guns as their armament. Even on these tanks, the British and Americans began installing two-man turrets. In the USSR, light tanks, with the exception of small scout tanks, were produced with two-man turrets and 45mm cannons starting in 1933. No one in their right mind produced medium tanks with turrets that housed fewer than 2 crew members. No one except the French. The situation became even stranger starting in 1933. On October 23, 1933, Germany withdrew from the Disarmament Commission, signaling the start of an arms race. At that time, the Char B1 design was more refined, making it the highest priority tank. As for the Renault D2, it required further development, and overall, the French Infantry Command believed a combat tank was superior. It is also interesting that in the summer of 1933, work began on a new light tank, which was essentially a replacement for the Renault FT. This tank, weighing approximately 13,228 pounds, had the same armament but received thicker armor. Initially, the armor was 30mm thick, but it was later reinforced to 40mm. As with the Char D2, this armor was intended to protect against 25mm cannons. 14 firms participated in the competition, but Renault ultimately celebrated victory with its Renault ZM prototype. After further modifications, the combat weight steadily increased, reaching almost 24,251 pounds on the production model Renault R35. This is not to mention that there was a second finalist in the competition, the FCM 36. Thus, a truly unique situation emerged where the successors of the Renault FT were positioned in 3 tank classes: light, medium, and heavy. To top it all off, tanks for the cavalry were developed alongside infantry tanks. More precisely, these were armored vehicles, as cavalry officially did not have tanks. It could be said that the cavalry represented a more rational part of French tank development, albeit with its own unique characteristics. For reconnaissance needs, light scout tanks of the AMR family, including the AMR-33 and AMR-35, were created, featuring machine gun armament. At the time of their creation, these were quite modern tanks and additionally possessed high mobility. The more numerous combat armored vehicles of the AMC family became prevalent. Initially, these were truly armored cars, both wheeled and half-tracked, but by the early 1930s, tank development became the priority. The first was the AMC-34, produced in a small series of 16 units. Initially, these tanks received a single-man APX-1 turret, similar to those installed on the Char D2 and Char B1, but later a 2-man APX-2 turret appeared on them. This marked the first instance of a 2-man turret on a French light tank. However, the cavalry was on a shoestring budget, and in the case of the AMC-34, this was more an exception than the rule. However, the cavalry command also periodically deviated, similar to the infantry command. A prime example of this was the development of a cavalry combat armored vehicle larger than the AMC-34. In 1934, a program began to develop a 3-man tank, whose crew size increased to include a radio operator, thus repeating the history of the D1-D2. This resulted in the cavalry tank SOMUA AC-4, which was adopted into service as the SOMUA S35. This very machine became the best French pre-war tank design. Although largely similar to the Char D2 and featuring a very similar turret design, this machine had much higher reliability and mobility. However, it was expensive, and the SOMUA factory could not fully meet the cavalry's needs. Therefore, the Hotchkiss H-35, a light 2-man tank, was also adopted into service. This tank initiated the development program for a Renault FT replacement. It possessed virtually the same advantages and disadvantages as the Renault R35, but offered superior mobility and reliability. In short, despite starting with original designs, the French cavalry ultimately received tanks that were almost full equivalents of infantry tanks, but with greater mobility. The cavalry also had a third combat armored vehicle, an evolution of the AMC-34. This was the AMC-35, a modified tank with a changed layout and more powerful armament. However, this most mass-produced pre-war French tank with a two-man turret also became the most problematic. The machine's reliability was extremely low and remained so until the beginning of World War II. Furthermore, the tank did not surpass the Hotchkiss H-35H-39 in mobility and was significantly inferior in armor protection. By 1937, France was building 5 types of light tanks, 2 types of medium tanks, and 1 type of heavy tank. By that time, the Char B1 had undergone modernization and transformed into the Char B1 bis. No other country could afford the luxury of 5 types of light tanks. Meanwhile, the Char D2 was produced in a tiny series of 50 units, with its development frozen for several years. An ironic situation arose where the cavalry had more medium tanks than the infantry. Such an unusual state of affairs did not exist in any other country worldwide. Moreover, the French infantry command, after the Renault R35 tanks began to enter service, suddenly realized that the main light tank they adopted had numerous problems with its running gear. Consequently, the Hotchkiss H-35 was also ordered for infantry units. As a final complication, work on super heavy tanks for the Maginot Line resumed in 1936. The initial concept for a tank weighing 99,208 pounds was essentially a variation of the Char B1, meaning an even larger replacement for the Renault FT, which was further enhanced in armor protection. In short, the crisis of ideas reached a terminal stage, and as time progressed, this crisis intensified further. This was particularly true for super heavy tanks, whose combat mass in early 1940 reached between 306,441 and 319,679 pounds. Meanwhile, their level of uselessness only increased. The confusion within the French command was most clearly demonstrated by the Char G program. On December 16, 1935, just a few weeks after the decision was made to begin serial production of the SOMUA S35, the French Infantry Command prepared specifications for a 20-ton tank. In fact, it largely repeated the specifications for the SOMUA S35, but with an increased maximum speed of up to 31 miles per hour. Incidentally, this clearly showed that the French infantry was quite interested in mobility. However, by 1936, the situation had changed. The French military decided they wanted to combine 2 tanks, the Char D and the Char B, onto a single chassis. As a result, a 75mm howitzer appeared on the front hull plate. The 6 companies participating in the competition had to urgently redesign their tanks. Ultimately, the only tank built according to the original specifications was the Char G1P, developed by SEAM under the leadership of Andrei Poniatowski. The 26-ton combat vehicle, which began trials in December 1936, featured an electromechanical transmission. The trials ended in failure. Instead of reaching 25 miles per hour, it could only achieve 9 miles per hour. Furthermore, the G1P quickly became obsolete, as the French military once again revised the specifications. One reason for the change in specifications was the success of another competitor, Renault. Renault decided not to follow the specifications completely, but to create something of their own. The result was a tank that could be equipped with either a 75mm gun with a 32 caliber barrel length or a 47mm gun whose projectile had an initial velocity of 2,625 feet per second. The tank, given the factory designation Renault ACK, differed not only in its armament. The turret had minimal dimensions, with its crew effectively located within the hull. Its combat weight was approximately 25 to 26 tons. The tank looked very promising, but the turret, designed by Lieutenant Colonel Balland, was criticized. Further development was intended to follow the Renault ACK line, but with significant modifications. Calculations carried out by STCC and ARL showed that the 20-ton weight class would be exceeded with no chance of reducing the mass. For this reason, on February 1, 1938, the combat weight limit was raised to 35 tons. In fact, the Renault G1R turned out lighter. Its mass was projected to be 32 tons, with the caveat that this was if the Renault Ballon turret was used. During 1938 and 1939, alternative turret designs were also explored, which were heavier but less complex. These turrets were developed by FCM and ARL, though only textual descriptions of them have survived. The results of the Char G program were unfortunate. The G1R never even reached the prototype stage. By June 1940, only the tank's hull had been prepared. The Lorraine project remained on paper. The tank developed by Baudet-Donald-Roussel, or BDR, had the most fortunate outcome. It never became a tank, but its chassis served as the basis for creating the ARL Fe-39 self-propelled artillery system. A similar fate befell the 20-ton SOMUA tank. Its developments were later used in creating the SOMUA SAU-40 self-propelled artillery system. Neither of these vehicles progressed beyond the prototype stage. Nevertheless, their serial production was at least planned. The unfortunate story of the Char G program was not the only such instance. In June 1937, the AMX Design Bureau, which was the name given to the Renault factory after its nationalization in 1936, began work on a successor to the Renault R35, the FCM36, and the Hotchkiss H35. Initially, the tank, designated AMX-38, was intended to be in the 10-ton weight class, but this could not be maintained. The first prototype, built in the spring of 1939, already had a combat weight of 13.5 tons. Following its evolution, the combat weight increased to 16.5 tons, and the armament was upgraded to a 47mm SA-35 gun. However, this was not the limit. The last iteration of the tank, which received armor 60mm thick, turned out even heavier at 20 tons. This meant it became a full equivalent of a medium tank, but with a two-man crew. One is tempted to say, "Hello once again, Renault FT." The overall picture was bleak. By the start of World War II, French tank development had produced exaggerated variations of what were, at best, 1920s tank designs. Moreover, most of these tanks were overloaded. This affected not only their mobility but also their reliability. Additionally, the significant chassis overload left no room for further modernization, which was a critical factor during wartime. A different outcome was unlikely, as even the deaths of Estienne and Velpri changed little. In August 1939, General Louis Keller was appointed Inspector of Armored Forces, but his views were no different from his predecessors. In fact, it was under Keller that super-heavy tanks reached a design weight of nearly 300,000 pounds, and projects for other heavily armored behemoths of various sizes and weights were conceived. The voice of reason, coming from individuals like Colonel Charles de Gaulle, who advocated for medium tanks as the primary type, remained unheard. This bleak picture regarding the development of new French tanks might create the illusion that only the French faced such difficulties. In reality, this was not the case. A crisis of ideas could be observed in nearly all tank-building nations of that period. For the Germans, their medium tanks were not immediately successful. Moreover, the Panzer IV, the most mass-produced German tank of the war, came about largely by chance, and their light tanks were far from ideal. The lack of prospects for the Panzer I became apparent as early as in Spain. The Panzer II was a typical example from the mid-1930s. With a 20mm automatic cannon and armor thickness of 0.59 inches, it had very little chance against new-generation French tanks. Furthermore, German light tanks also featured single-person turrets. As for the Panzer III, something resembling mass production only began in the autumn of 1939. The armored forces of Great Britain and the United States were primarily composed of light tanks armed with machine guns, which had technical specifications roughly comparable to the Panzer II. Czechoslovakia and Poland failed to develop successful medium tanks, while the Italians and Japanese only managed to create something resembling medium tanks closer to the start of World War II. In fact, the best situation was found in Soviet tank development, though with numerous caveats. Successors for new generation tanks, such as the T-29, PT-1A, and T-46, never materialized, and the self-propelled artillery development program ended in failure. There were also significant difficulties with tank armament. As a result, true replacements only appeared in 1939, with their production beginning in 1940. Furthermore, the replacement for the T-26 emerged even later in 1941, and full-scale production of the T-50 never fully commenced. In short, everyone had problems. In this context, a more crucial question was how quickly a country's industry could produce quality tanks in large quantities. Here, many questions arise concerning French industry, starting with quality. As mentioned earlier, reliable armor protection was one of the critical parameters when developing new generation light tanks. This armor had a thickness of 1.57 inches. The Renault R35 and Hotchkiss H35 featured hulls and turrets made from cast parts, while the FCM36 used rolled armor, assembled by welding. Cast armor was more convenient for manufacturing but inferior to rolled armor in terms of resistance. In June 1937, it was discovered that the German 3.7-centimeter PaK anti-tank gun achieved 14 penetrations out of 18 shots fired at a Renault R35. Even worse, a 25mm cannon also penetrated the tank's armor in half of the cases. Consequently, interest in the FCM36 sharply increased, but this tank never became a mass-produced model. Besides being a complex and expensive vehicle, the FCM was also involved in the Char B1 BIS program. The armor durability of the Renault R35 tank was a very concerning situation because virtually all new generation light and medium tanks were vulnerable to enemy fire. Here, it is important to caution against comparing only tanks based on their technical specifications. The main task of French tanks was not to fight enemy armored vehicles, but to combat infantry, artillery, and light fortifications. This is where the possibility of being hit by 37mm anti-tank guns at a range of 1,000 feet or closer was a huge problem. The chances of encountering such a gun in an ambush were much higher than encountering a German tank. One significant problem for French tanks was poor visibility. In practice, the commander's cupolas did not perform their duties well, nor did the turret viewing devices. Add to this the fact that the commander had to handle multiple roles. Moreover, radio stations were not installed on all French light tanks, which created an additional communication problem. For light tanks, there was another problem: armament. By the early 1930s, it was believed that the 37mm short-barreled gun would be sufficient. However, in practice, it had weak, high-explosive capabilities, and its armor-piercing shell was roughly equivalent to a heavy machine gun. This is why the Americans rejected a similar gun, using a heavy machine gun instead. It was only closer to 1938 that the French military realized the true capabilities of their main gun. As a result, urgent development began on a new 37mm gun, which, despite its designation, actually entered production in 1940. This gun had greater armor penetration than the previous model, but not by much. At a range of 328 feet, it could penetrate armor 29mm thick. Thus, there was a minimal chance of penetrating the armor of German medium tanks. In fact, even with the new gun, French light tanks could only fight against German light tanks, and by the spring of 1940, frontal armor screens were being installed on Panzer II tanks. Therefore, the cavalry tanks AMC-34, AMC-35, and AMR-35 ZT-2, which numbered under 100 in total, offered some real effectiveness. The Char B1 BIS had more or less effective armor protection, and it was often heard that these vehicles were practically invulnerable. In reality, this was not entirely true. Yes, these tanks received 60mm of armor all around, and in some instances, they truly demonstrated remarkable durability. However, this was more often a stroke of luck than a rule. First, the Char B1 BIS had many vulnerable points: the driver's viewing device, the engine cooling air intake on the side of the hull, and the running gear. Instances of them being hit in these areas were quite frequent. Second, the Char B1 BIS itself often became its own worst enemy. It should be noted that the prototype tanks had a combat weight of 55,116 pounds. The production Char B1 weighed 59,525 pounds, and the Char B1 BIS gained weight to 70,548 pounds. Of course, during development, the running gear was reinforced and a more powerful engine was installed, but there should be no illusions. The additional 15,432 pounds of load negatively affected the tank's reliability. Furthermore, the French command had plans to transition to the 79,366-pound Char B1 Terre. Third, as mentioned earlier, tank versus tank battles were not as frequent. More often, they had to fight against German infantry, which was armed not only with 37mm anti-tank guns. Often, 105mm howitzers were used against tanks, and in 1938, 88mm anti-aircraft guns were reclassified as dual-purpose weapons. This means that the use of the famous 88s against heavily armored tanks was by no means an improvisation. Even without considering the highly specific way the French used their tanks and their poor supply system, a bleak picture emerges. By September 1, 1939, the most common tank in the French army remained the Renault FT. Its various replacements suffered from several drawbacks. While they caused significant trouble for German infantry, they did not meet the expectations of the French infantry command. Heavy tanks performed much better, but their successes were limited. Medium tanks could have solved the problem, but the French infantry had only 50 of these, and their equipment was significantly worn out. By the spring of 1940, the situation became so critical that some Char B1 tanks were recalled from Africa. Practice showed that these outdated tanks were more effective than the new generation of light tanks. In fact, the best tanks available to the French army were the SOMUA S35s, which were officially classified as armored vehicles. Also noteworthy were the Hotchkiss H-39s, a further development of the H-35. Despite having several flaws from the original design, these machines at least possessed normal mobility. Let us shift from quality to quantity. The Anschluss of Austria and subsequent events occurred not only for political reasons but also for military ones. In short, French military leaders suddenly realized they had little with which to oppose the Germans. By April 1938, the French army had only 2 regiments equipped with medium Char D2 tanks and heavy Char B1 tanks. The first contract for the Char B1 bis was completed only in the spring of 1938. Additionally, there were about 100 SOMUA S35s, some of which had only recently entered service. The production of other tanks was in a similar state. Certainly, the German situation was not much better, but as mentioned, artillery was the primary adversary of tanks. The British also existed, but their tank situation was even more neglected. The British Army simply did not possess a single new generation medium tank. In short, the policy of appeasing Hitler also served the practical goal of shifting their own industry to a wartime footing. By September 1, 1939, the situation was no longer as critical. Nevertheless, the phony war began far from by chance. By September 2, 1939, French infantry possessed a total of 975 Renault R35s, 98 Hotchkiss H35s, 200 Hotchkiss H39s, 100 FCM36, 2,850 Renault FTs, 160 Char D1s, 50 Char D2s, 149 Char B1 and Char B1 bis tanks, and 6 FCM2Cs. On the same date, the cavalry had 120 AMR-33s, 190 AMR-35s, 12 AMC-34s, 16 AMC-35s, 300 Hotchkiss H-35s, 16 Hotchkiss H-39s, and 246 SOMUA S-35s. This seemed like an entire armada, but it was not quite so. From an organizational perspective, there were numerous problems, and 2/3 of the 4,520 infantry tanks were outdated Renault FTs. Moreover, there were many questions regarding the Renault R35. It was no coincidence that these machines were the only new French tanks permitted for export. The Char B1 and B1 BIS were sufficient to equip only 3 regiments, which began reorganizing into tank battalions in August 1939. In reality, the French did have opportunities to inflict, if not a defeat, then at least significant damage on the German defenses in September 1939, but they proved too cautious. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, there were enormous organizational problems. As a result, all the French managed to do was launch the Saar offensive, which quickly ran out of steam. Following this, frantic efforts began on both sides of the front to strengthen military potential. At this point, the French army's chances rapidly diminished. While the Germans focused on producing medium tanks, the French prioritized the production of the Char B1 bis. This was truly a colossal mistake. A costly and overloaded tank would not have become genuinely mass-produced, even with production restructuring. In addition to Renault, FAMH, FCM, and Schneider were involved in the production of this tank even before the war. In November 1939, a 5th factory, AMX, joined the production of the Char B1 bis tank. This gradually increased production, but not at the planned rate. Even at its peak production in March 1940, the monthly output was only 45 tanks. In contrast, SOMUA alone produced between 20 and 22 tanks each month. The Germans, however, acted quite differently. By the summer of 1939, production of the Panzer II had already slowed to a small stream, and by December, it stopped entirely. The Panzer III became the priority, with its production established at 6 factories, a number later increased to 7. The results were quickly evident. From September to December 1939, 157 Panzer III tanks were built, despite the fact that the vehicle required significant modifications. In the first 5 months of 1940, an additional 258 tanks of this type were delivered, even though German factories were not yet operating at full capacity. To these figures, we must add 149 Panzer IV tanks and 227 Panzer 38T tanks, manufactured from September 1939 to May 1940. This count does not include the tanks already in service. Therefore, by May 10, 1940, the German army had a qualitative advantage over the French in tank quality. French factories deserve separate mention. The key tank manufacturing enterprises, including Renault, AMX, Hotchkiss, APX, and ARL, were located around Paris. This also applied to 100% of the facilities producing tank weaponry. When the Germans approached Paris in June 1940, the French were effectively left without most of their tank production facilities, as well as without tank engines and guns. After this point, any further resistance became meaningless. It is also worth noting that in 1940, French factories were operating at their production limits, which caused a significant decline in the quality of tank manufacturing. This was particularly evident in the second batch of Char D2 tanks. Numerous complaints regarding low tank reliability were received from military units. As is known, miracles do not happen, and an increase in quantity often comes at the cost of quality. Furthermore, the French simply had no remaining capacity to increase production. In this light, plans for developing the ARL 539 and SOMUA SAU-40 appeared somewhat naive, as this could only happen by reducing the output of other tanks. Any notion of a France 1941, a scenario sometimes envisioned by alternative history enthusiasts, was out of the question. Even if the Germans had been held back in May and June 1940, further defeat was only a matter of time. The Germans still outperformed the French, both in tank quantity and even more so in quality.